bodyweight training is a viable option to build muscle requiring minimal equipment. However, there are some unique practical considerations to be aware of when using calisthenics for muscle growth. Are bodyweight exercises enough, or do you need to perform extra accessory lifts? How do you apply progressive overload for calisthenics training? And how does technique differ when using calisthenics for muscle growth compared with strength or skill training? The first thing we need to understand is that calisthenics is just another form of resistance training. The goal of resistance training for the purposes of muscle growth is to induce internal muscular stress. And if we stress our physiology in the right way, muscle growth can be achieved as an adaptation. This internal stress can be achieved in many different ways, and calisthenics is just one way of achieving it. So for the most part, the general principles of training for muscle growth remain the same for both traditional resistance training and calisthenics. However, in terms of the practical application of calisthenics for hypertrophy, there may be some unique factors we need to consider. The first and most obvious consideration is for exercise selection. Calisthenics, depending on your specific definition, generally refers to bodyweight movements. So inherently you are limited to bodyweight exercises. This has two implications for muscle growth. The first is for exercise variety. Compared with traditional resistance training, calisthenics training may be slightly limited in the number of exercises a muscle group is able to be trained with. And while limited exercise variety can still result in great muscle growth, it might not be quite as effective compared with training each muscle group with a larger number of exercises. This was seen in this case study, which compared the effects of training with a single versus multiple exercise variants. 22 detrained men performed one of either the following exercise routines for 9 weeks. Half the subjects performed the same exercises for each muscle group 3 times per week, while the other half performed 3 different exercise variants for the same muscle group in each of the 3 workouts. It was found that both groups experienced significant increases in muscle thickness of all muscles measured, although the group training with more variation saw slightly superior gains overall. And while this may be somewhat of a limitation, I don't think it is a major issue for calisthenics training. As a practical recommendation, it would be ideal to try and find at least 2 exercises that train each major muscle group if possible. And in most cases, this can be achieved. However, if you can only feasibly train a muscle group with 1 exercise, then that is still going to produce great muscle growth. It might just not be absolutely optimal. The second implication is for accessory lifts. Since calisthenics movements are mostly compound exercises, you might find that some muscle groups aren't maximally stressed. Muscle groups like the biceps, triceps, and hamstrings are sometimes difficult to train effectively using compound exercises alone. For example, this study compared the effects of performing rows versus bicep curls on biceps hypertrophy. It was found that biceps muscle thickness increased from both exercises, but greater gains were experienced from the isolated curls. Furthermore, this study compared the effects of squat training with full versus partial range of motion on muscle growth. It was found that overall, squat training was effective for quadriceps, glutes, and adductor muscle growth, but not for the hamstrings. And this study compared the effects of performing the bench press and/or tricep extensions in different orders. Triceps cross-sectional area increased to some extent from all conditions, although less growth was achieved when performing bench press training alone. Since calisthenics movements are mostly compound exercises, you might opt to add some accessory lifts to maximally stress these muscle groups. Adding some exercises like bicep curls, tricep extensions, reverse flies, and leg curls can train the muscles that the main calisthenics movements might not fully exhaust. There may be some creative ways to perform more isolated exercises for these muscles using bodyweight training, but you could also add some traditional resistance training for these muscles if it is viable. The second consideration is for the rep ranges and load used. For muscle growth, we are able to achieve similar muscle growth across a wide variety of rep ranges and loads, provided that we train close to failure. However, it is possible for loads to be too light to maximize muscle growth. This study compared the effects of training with different loads on hypertrophy. 30 untrained men performed single-arm bicep curls and single-leg leg extensions for 12 weeks with either 20, 40, 60, or 80% 1RM. It was found that all loads produced similar increases in biceps and quadriceps cross-sectional area, apart from the 20% 1RM load, which saw slightly less growth. So it seems that when training with less than around 40% 1RM, which is equivalent to about a 30 rep max, it is probably too light to maximize muscle growth. Similarly, when training too heavy, we might also be limiting muscle growth slightly. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of training with moderate versus heavy loads on muscle growth. 19 men with at least 1 year of resistance training experience performed a full body resistance training program, performing 3 sets of each exercise to failure 3 times per week for 8 weeks. Half the subjects trained within the 8 to 12 rep range, while the others trained within the 2 to 4 rep range. It was found that both groups achieved significant growth, but the moderate load produced slightly superior increases in biceps, triceps, and quadriceps muscle thickness. So it seems that when training with fewer than around 5 reps, muscle growth is slightly limited. As a practical recommendation, we can probably train anywhere within the approximate 5 to 30 rep range and achieve similar muscle growth on a per set basis, provided we are training close to failure. Now, in terms of how this relates to calisthenics, the load we use is predetermined because we use our body weight. And if your body weight is sufficient for you to train close to failure within the effective hypertrophy rep range, then that is okay. However, if you find that you are able to exceed this range, then adding additional external load is probably going to be beneficial, if it is feasible. For example, if you can perform more than 30 push-ups in a row, then finding a way to add a little extra load can help make it more effective. Similarly, if you find that body weight alone is too heavy and doesn't allow you to reach the effective hypertrophy rep range, it can be helpful to add assistance if it is feasible. For example, if you can't perform at least 5 bodyweight chin-ups, then using a resistance band to assist you can help make it more effective. The next strategy that can be useful for calisthenics training are metabolite techniques. This refers to strategies which take advantage of acute fatigue to reach failure sooner. Some examples include drop sets, myo reps, pre-fatigue, supersets, and so on. These training strategies can be useful for exercises where you are able to perform a high number of reps. Rather than performing one set, resting for a designated duration, then performing another set, metabolite techniques can help us reach failure without having to perform so many reps each set. For example, if you can perform 20 plus reps for an abdominal exercise, you could implement a strategy like myo reps. This would involve performing your first set to or close to failure, resting for 20 to 30 seconds, then performing as many reps as you can until you reach failure, or close to it. Then repeat for as many myo rep sets as you have planned. This way you are able to reach failure earlier without having to complete a high rep count every single set. The next consideration for calisthenics training is lifting technique. This isn't necessarily a unique consideration, but something that is certainly worth mentioning when it comes to calisthenics. Technique for hypertrophy training in general is all about trying to maximally stress a specific muscle group. This is achieved in a few different ways, such as controlling the eccentric or lowering phase of each rep, training through a full range of motion to get the muscle into a stretched position, and training with a movement pattern which requires the target muscle to do the majority of the work. And these principles remain the same for calisthenics training, as they do for any other form of resistance training aimed at building muscle. The reason it is important to reiterate is because calisthenics is often used for more than just muscle growth. It is often used to develop skill and strength. These training goals generally require a slightly different execution to maximize progress. We essentially want to use the technique that is most efficient for the specific goal we are trying to achieve. Rather than being concerned with internal muscular stress, these forms of training are all about the external load or execution of the skill that is able to be achieved. As an example, when performing pull-ups or chin-up variants for the purposes of muscle growth, we want to control the lowering phase, achieve a full stretch in the bottom position, and limit external momentum to lift up. As an example for strength training, dips might be performed in a way that is most efficient and only to the required legal depth based on the strength standards that are being followed. And if you were trying to perform a skill such as a muscle up, then you would want to generate some momentum and take advantage of the most efficient movement pattern. And the last consideration for calisthenics training is progressive overload. There are three primary ways in which progressive overload can be applied to calisthenics training. The primary way in which progression will be applied for calisthenics training is to perform more reps. As muscle is built, we need to make the training stimulus more challenging to continue making progress, which is primarily achieved by increasing reps or load. But since the load is predetermined as our body weight, it is not always feasible to increase load. So doing more reps is going to be the primary way in which progressive overload is applied in the short term. And as long as we are training somewhere within the approximate 5 to 30 rep range, we will be providing an effective hypertrophic stimulus. However, for some bodyweight exercises, it is possible to exceed this effective range after a while. So to stay within the effective hypertrophy range, we might look at adding some external load if it is feasible. Adding plates to a weight belt, wearing a weight vest, or holding a dumbbell are ways to increase the external load so that you can continue making training highly stimulative. For example, someone might be able to perform more than 30 reps on calf raises. Wearing a weight vest or holding a dumbbell can increase the total load lifted, allowing you to train within the effective hypertrophy rep ranges. And the other way in which progressive overload can be applied to calisthenics training is via an increase in the exercise difficulty. Some exercises are naturally more difficult than others. So if a greater stimulus is required, a more challenging exercise variation can be used to increase the stress imposed on a muscle group. This can be achieved by swapping to a more challenging variation of the same exercise, going from a bilateral to a unilateral variation, or by swapping to a new exercise altogether. For example, an exercise progression for the back muscles could progress from an inverted row with your feet on the ground to an inverted row with your feet elevated to pull-ups. Let's now summarize what we have discussed. Calisthenics is simply another form of resistance training that can be used to build muscle mass. Therefore, the training principles remain the same for calisthenics as they do for any other form of resistance training. However, there are some practical aspects of calisthenics training which should be considered to maximize muscle growth. First is for exercise selection. With calisthenics training, you are obviously limited to certain bodyweight movements. And this will be completely fine for muscle growth, but you may not maximally stress all major muscle groups. So if it is viable, you might seek to introduce some additional accessory lifts if you want to ensure maximal growth. In terms of rep ranges and load, bodyweight training already determines the load you use, and that is your body weight. Depending on the exercise and the strength of the individual, this load may be sufficient. But if it is too light or too heavy, you might want to add external load or use some assistance to stay within the effective hypertrophy rep ranges. For exercises where you are able to perform a high number of reps, you can use some Metabolite techniques for a more efficient workout. This can allow you to reach failure sooner without having to perform high reps for every set. In terms of technique, we want to lift in a way that maximally stresses the target muscle group, if the goal is to build muscle. This differs from strength and skill training, where we would want to use the most efficient technique for the specific task. And for progressive overload, there are three primary ways in which we can progress calisthenics training. The primary way is to increase the number of reps performed. We can also add external load for exercises where it is viable. And we can increase the difficulty of the exercise itself by implementing a more challenging variant training the same muscle groups. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.